Greg Sadler, you said something to me back when I think you were writing your blog post at that point about grief. And you had said, "Hey, I've got some material that I'm working on grief." By the way, anybody who hasn't, and Larry, I'll stick the link in the chat if I haven't done it or we haven't done it yet. Those posts are powerful and there's a lot of information out there. But the thing is, I know that as we swapped emails back and forth, you and I share something in this consideration of grief, and that we both lost our fathers when we were young. And I have always felt that for me, this was very formative.
Mm.
For decades of my life, I have said to people, I think that losing my father at a very young age has made me a lot of who I am today. I don't know if you feel the same way, but I wondered if you might.
Yeah, I mean, I was a good bit older than you, actually, that the age that your older siblings,
Yeah.
were. I was just turning 12 when we lost my dad, and, yeah, it made a huge impact, and I think, you know, this is gonna sound like a little bit of a pitch, but nobody really knew how to handle it well. I got all sorts of, like, well-meaning but bad advice from the adults around me or just,
Mhm.
weird treatment, and yeah, and then there's all sorts of things, like, there's nobody to teach you how to shave properly, so until you I didn't learn how to do it properly until I was in the army, you know, and then you really had to learn very quickly because otherwise they'd make you
Yeah.
dry shave in formation. But, how to handle the sorta typical jockeying with other guys about stuff. I mean, I wound up being very, very aggressive, as a kid, in part because I didn't, like, know how to take a joke or when, you didn't learn those sorts of things that you need. But, something I was really reflecting on, so both of us got to see not just the effects of our dads being gone, but we got to see our moms having to deal with that and
Mm.
managing the natural wish to grieve a spouse, the person that you're essentially closest with the responsibilities of taking care of, the kids that you've had together, you know? And I think that's thinking about, what it's like for other people who are grieving along with us is something important too.
Yeah. Well, you're spot on there. And I still wish that I would the strength of will that my mother has had to persist and now flourish really in that spot. But I think when I think about the loss side of this, I mean, for you or for
Yeah.
me personally, I never had my mother remarried, but I never had a warm relationship with my stepfather, right? All the fairy tales are about evil stepmothers, but I had a stepfather.
Yeah.
I did not say people that he was an evil stepfather. I just said I didn't have that warm relationship. Don't carry this too far. But I mean, I never had that warm relationship. So I was in fact also trying to figure my way through the world without that model that I
Yeah.
needed. And I felt like that's a challenge, but it has also caused me to think deeply about grief. And, I've tried to prepare my own children for what this means. And, we have now lost their grandfather. And I said, I remember at that time saying, we are going to lean into this, right? We are going to be part of the process. We are going to support each other, but we are not going to look away in this moment. And that was kind of part of our process. So I think it's been very formative for me, and I know that it is important to you, and I am delighted that you are here to help us out today.
Oh,
So can I
thanks.
introduce
Yeah.
you and let you do
Yeah,
your thing?
absolutely.
All right. Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me giving a warm welcome to Greg Sadler. He's a philosopher, experienced educator, and a dynamic speaker, which you are about to witness. With an impressive career spanning 2 decades, Greg has taught and designed courses in philosophy, humanities, religious studies, and critical thinking. Having returned to his hometown, Milwaukee, in 2015, Greg and his partner Andy have become catalysts for intellectual engagement, organizing humanities and philosophy centered groups in the greater Milwaukee area. Greg holds an MA and a PhD in philosophy from Southern Illinois University Carbondale, and his scholarly contributions have spanned the history of Western philosophy with publications ranging from books to articles and encyclopedia entries. Beyond academia, Greg puts philosophy into practice through his private practice, Reason.io, where he offers philosophical counseling, executive leadership coaching, and ethics consultation services. He is the former editor of Stoicism Today, serving from 2016 and 2022. But you know what? I think he still has some role in that. So I don't think he's really retired in that regard. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me give a warm welcome to Gregory Sadler. And I want to say one last thing. I'm off script now, so this is just Phil talking. So, I always say that, what we're trying to do with conversations with modern stoicism is we start with a trusted voice, right? And have a trusted voice kind of seed a conversation for us. And then we go off and we kind of wrestle with those ideas on our
Mhm.
own, which is exactly what we're going to do today. And when I say trusted voice, that's code word for someone who deals with a material with intellectual rigor. And if you've ever had any opportunity to go back and read any of Greg's stuff or watch his YouTube videos, he is bringing intellectual rigor to what we are doing here today. And it's why I am very happy to have him with us. So, Greg, thank you. The floor is yours, my friend.
Oh, thanks. Thanks for that very nice introduction. So, yeah, a lot to talk about, I would say. Grief is one of those emotions that is pretty much unavoidable for all of us. And probably we're going to encounter it multiple times in our life. So it's not like we can just rip the band aid off and be finished with it. And I wanted to begin with something that Seneca points out. He talks about our tendency to fear all sorts of things that the Stoics would say are, strictly speaking, indifference. And he says, well, it's understandable that we fear death so much because you're not getting away from it. You might avoid poverty, you might avoid illness. There's all sorts of things that you can actually not have to suffer, but you're going to die sooner or later, whether you like it or not. And it's not just you. Everybody you know in the world will either die after you or before you or at the same time. So, I often point that out to my undergrad classes, kids that are like literally off the bus and, tell them you should prepare for this as we're studying this material. And you might even think about this. If you adopt a puppy or a kitten, you are adopting something that 10, 20, maybe 30 years from now, you're going to have to deal with the loss of because we all have the sort of shelf life, you can say. And grief can not only be over the death of people that we love or care about, but over all sorts of other things. Epictetus talks about a mother grieving her son who's at school and she knows he's going to come back, but he's gone for the time being, or a friend moving away and you won't see them again unless you're particularly lucky. And we grieve other things too. We grieve the loss or breakdown of a relationship, whether it's familial or friendship or romantic or even just a companion. We might grieve when we lose a job, particularly Americans who seem to be very invested in our job identity. And people even grieve with, I would say, real emotion of grief, the ending of a show that they've become particularly attached to, or a fictional character who doesn't exist at all, and it can be in a show, it can be in a book. So there's all these things. So what do the Stoics have to say about the emotion of grief and the actions of grieving and other related topics? I've got 5 things that I'm going to throw at you real quick, and then we'll follow up on 3 of them. So the first is that there is what we could call like an official party line position that the Stoics have. And I think it's one that a lot of us, if that's all we had, would probably struggle with. And it might turn us off a bit from Stoicism. It might be one of those things we have to compartmentalize. So we're going to look at that first. And then we have the things that actual Stoic authors have to say about it. So they're, Seneca to the rescue, so to speak. If you read some of his letters, he has a much more humane attitude about it. I do want to give a kind of caution. So Phil mentioned, rigor and stuff like that. I often say this. So you may have heard me pitch this entire line before. I think that Stoicism is a complex system of ideas that inform each other and they make their full sense when they're put in connection with each other. So, not isolated out like sound bites or life hacks or anything like that. And these are expressed in particular passages that can be found in particular Stoic texts. And if you take those little passages and you just turn them into quotes and you throw them out there, you're not really getting the full Stoic position on it. And sometimes it can lead to misunderstandings. And I think this is particularly problematic when it comes to some of the things Epictetus, for example, says about grieving and loss. So we want to contextualize these things. The other thing that I'll mention, so this is the fourth point, we don't have to just stick with the Stoic texts. There are problems and issues that maybe they didn't discuss that we do face, and we'll talk about a few of those. And I think we can think about those in a way that's, let's say, marching in the same direction as the Stoics. And, I think the fifth point that I had in here is probably superfluous. It's just stoicism and grief, and grieving is a topic that I've presented and written on a lot, motivated by the fact that I've had to deal with it, as Phil and I were talking about just earlier. So it was kind of, one of those existential things. I'm not just interested in it as a abstract topic. I think it's pretty important for all of us. So we're going to look first at what we can call the official Stoic position is. And this is derived more or less from thinkers like Aristodemus and Cicero and Diogenes Laertius, who give us summaries of Stoic ethics. So, put very simply, as an emotion, grief is a bad thing for Stoics. And that's easy to say and maybe hard to swallow. So it's a normal question to ask. Well, why would it possibly be a bad thing? And this is not really a worry for people who get stoicism wrong, by the way. The people who think that stoicism is all about repressing your bad or painful emotions, lock them up, throw away the key, don't acknowledge them. They're fine with that, right? But that's not what the Stoics actually teach. So the Stoics had some good reasons for thinking that grief could be a bad thing. And part of this has to do with the Stoic theory of the emotions. So a lot of you are probably familiar with this, but I'll give you a very, very quick rundown anyway. So the Stoics distinguish between what we sometimes translate as emotions or passions, the pathe in Greek, which are, we could call them bad emotional states from a Stoic perspective, and then good emotional states, the eupathei in Greek or the constantiae in Latin. And what makes them good or bad is whether they are guided by reason or integrated with reason, or whether they're against reason in certain ways, right? So the Stoics had this four-part breakdown of all the emotions. You could think of it as like a square. And again, many of you are probably already very familiar with this. And they thought that emotions have not just a feeling or affective side and an action-oriented side, but also a cognitive side that involves judgments, or sometimes it's translated as opinions or assumptions. So there's four classes, general classes of emotion. If you're responding to what you take to be a present good, and this is an appearance, then you feel the things that we class as pleasure or elation. If it's a present bad that you think you're encountering, then it's pain or distress. If it's a not present, but perhaps not that far off or future good, then you feel desire. And if it's a not present bad thing, then you feel fear. And all of these, again, it doesn't have to actually be a good thing or a bad thing. You just have to take it as being such, and you'll have that response. So three of these have a good emotional state. There's rational desire, there's rational fear, and there's rational pleasure. Joy, for example, is rational pleasure. The Stoics don't think you should be joyless. If you are, you're not doing Stoicism right, right? You should actually have desires about things, but they should be, reasonable desires. You should even have fear about some things, and they call that caution or eulabeia. Notice what there isn't. There's no for the official sort of Stoic position, there's no good kind of pain. And, this is something that we could talk about later, perhaps. Maybe there's some times when you should feel some sort of being upset about something, but they say, "No, no, there isn't anything like that." And so how could grief be bad? Well, it feels bad. I think all of us can relate to that. If you're grieving and somebody was saying to you, "Hey, you wanna do this for a couple 100 more years?" You'd be crazy to say, "Yeah, man, I love this. This is awesome." It's a crappy emotion in many ways. It's also, for the Stoics, bad for the person who's feeling it. It's bad, you could say, on our character in certain ways, or on our psychology, on the ways in which we think things out. And another thing that they bring up is it doesn't really benefit anyone or anything for you to feel grief, or if you were to die, for other people to feel grief for you. And so that's basically the Stoic position. And when you hear that, you might be like, well, this sucks, you know? I like the Stoics on a lot of stuff, but maybe this isn't one where I'm going to go with them. So here's where we want to look at what Stoic thinkers actually have to say. And we may as well grasp the proverbial bull by the horns, Epictetus, right? And there's 2 passages from the Enchiridion that we've all read that I think some of us have struggled with, and I think we want to use to center these ideas. So you're all familiar with Enchiridion 3, the famous one saying, "If you're kissing your child or your wife, tell yourself it's a human being whom you're kissing, and then when they die, you won't be disturbed." Now, disturbed is tarache, and so it doesn't mean that you're not gonna be upset at all. There was actually a great exchange about this a couple months back in the Nova Stoa, looking at what this term actually means. It means to be really upset, to be shaken in certain ways. And Epictetus is not saying that you shouldn't love or care for your child or your spouse or other people that you're connected with, because he says, in everything which pleases the soul, psychagonton, or supplies a want, chrea parechonton, or, here's the key, is loved, is what in some translations that you're fond of. This is coming from stergein in Greek, which means to have affection towards somebody. And Epictetus actually writes about familial affection. There's an entire chapter where he has a great discussion with a dad about that. So it doesn't mean that you don't love them, but the fact that they're gone doesn't have to destroy you. And that's all he's saying there. He's not saying, dissociate yourself from people so you don't get hurt. That wouldn't be stoicism. He also tells us, when you see somebody weeping in sorrow, and they uses the word for grief there, show them sympathy. And so that is to literally to bear the occasion with them. And you can even lament with them. And it's using, again, this sun term, with the person, but you don't have to lament internally. You don't have to like try to psych yourself into it, but it's okay to make gestures like that. So that gets us one thing. Cicero talks about something else that I think is really useful in the Tusculan Disputations, and this may be something that some of us have struggled with in the past. So he says that grieving is not the obligation that a lot of people make it out to be. There's a lot of people, he says, that think it's a duty, it's an obligation to show the deepest grief at the death of people who we care about. And so, when they like slip out of their grief, they force themselves back into it and they put on a gloomy demeanor and they view themselves as having done the wrong thing, right? And he even talks about mothers and teachers punishing children who show cheerfulness when a family is grieving, forcing them to shed tears, but for the wrong reason, giving them the wrong message. So I think that can be helpful. And then Seneca's letters, if any of you have ever read his letters 63 and 99, he's talking to Lucilius, who's just lost a close friend, and then he gives Lucilius a copy of a letter who he gave to another friend who had just lost a child. And Seneca thinks that it is reasonable to grieve and mourn within limits. So he's not only giving permission, he's saying you're a weirdo, Lucilius, if you don't grieve at all. He says that it would be unreasonable to expect that. And then he talks about even the sage, so the legendary wise person, is going to feel a sting or a bite of grief. Now, if you're into like the Stoic theory of emotions, this is what they call a proto passion. We don't have to get too hung up on that. The point is that even the sage is going to be affected by this because it's natural to us as well as to other animals. And so he says, let not our eyes be dry when we've lost a friend, but don't let them overflow. We can weep, but we must not wail. So he's making distinctions here. Just because we do feel grief doesn't mean that like the entire world has to turn dark to us and, we have to cry all the time. In letter 99, he says to this father who's grieving his lost child, he doesn't expect him to be hard-hearted, keeping his face unmoved at the funeral, not allowing the soul to feel a pinch of pain. That would not be good humanity. That would be a lack of feeling, not virtue. And he says tears fall even if we try to stop them, and by being shed, they ease the soul. We can allow them to fall if that's what's going to happen to us, but let's not command them to fall. Let's not grieve because it's a
Mm.
social obligation or because we feel like if we don't grieve, somehow we're, letting the person down. He also says in letter 63, it's really a short lived memory that you're giving your friend if it's only going to endure as long as your grief. And what Seneca presents to us, something that I've applied in my own practice, is a different use of our memory. Seneca thinks that we really can and ought to remember those that we've lost, but it's up to us how we're going to remember them. And so, he talks about a certain kind of bittersweet feeling that comes with it. And Seneca says, yeah, that's okay, but I can actually remember some of my friends now with only sweetness without the bitterness that comes with it. And it really does depend. And this is not just a Stoic thing. That, by the way, the Platonists did this, the Epicureans did this. Looks like other schools did this as well. This notion that you can actually decide what you want to focus your mind on. You can continue a conversation with the person who's dead. You have to make space within however you want to visualize it, your head, your heart, for them. And he says that we shouldn't just forget the beloved dead. We shouldn't bury their memory along with their body, mourning them at first and then rarely thinking about them afterwards. That's not the right way to go. Instead, we should cultivate a continued relationship with them if we can. Now, of course, with some people that may be more difficult if we don't know them very well, but perhaps that's not that big of an issue in that case, right? So I think that's some useful ideas. Does that give us everything that we need in the present? So there may be some people in here who came to Stoicism very young, but I think most of us came after we were already adults and maybe even lived as adults for decades and experienced a number of losses. And maybe we didn't handle those so well from a Stoic perspective at the time. And maybe we've got some lasting damage that we're still carrying around with us from those losses. So what do we do if that's the case? I don't think that there's anything explicit in the classic Stoic text that tells us what to do, but I would suggest that as with a lot of issues or problems, we might be able to like think about what the Stoics would tell us. And I think what they would say is, well, figure out what's going on with you. Instead of like trying to stuff your emotions down or pretend they don't exist or try to be a good Stoic, figure out what's actually going on in your head. Figure out what you repressed or put aside for the moment and then never got around to dealing with. Once you do that, then you can start undoing the damage, which is not just affective, it's probably cognitive as well. And we have to deal with ourselves as we find ourselves, not just try to aspirationally, force them into a mold of the good stoic. And this is probably a long and complex process if it's dealing with grief, because grief occurs when we lose something or someone significant. So, you know, I think that a good stoic approach to things is if we didn't allow ourselves to feel grief. And I'll mention, when I was a kid, I grew up here in the Midwest. My dad died in the early 80s. I had all of these idiot relatives and friends saying, "You're the man of the house now at 11 years old. You need to like step up." There wasn't any room for crying or anything like that. I didn't actually start grieving properly for my dad until as a kid, an 8th grader, I read the Odyssey and got to see that Odysseus and his men were weeping as they're rowing, and that was a very transformative moment for me, seeing that tough guys could actually cry because it just
Mm,
wasn't, that was not okay here in Wisconsin in the 1980s. Maybe we all have to do things like that. There could be all sorts of grief that we're still carrying around with us that we do need to allow ourselves to feel. But maybe we could apply what Seneca was talking about. That doesn't mean that you have to like wallow in it and that's all you can think about all day long for years and years. But we do have to acknowledge the emotions that we have. And I think that if we do that, we can also adopt that other suggestion of Seneca. We can start to remember our lost loved ones without so much sadness. And the sadness is not a sign that we love them. It's not an obligation that we have to them. If they're any good or if they were any good as people, they would probably not want us to be so sad and to not be able to get on with our lives. So I think there's a lot of Stoic considerations in Seneca and Cicero and Epictetus that can be quite helpful for us. And that's all that I've got for you. I know Phil has some questions that he wants to ask, and we'll have further Q&A later.